Deir mahese. Is mis Dónall Ó Duḃġaıll. Taoiseach Gaeltach an Uaille Uair I Workhouse, Ontario, agus scríbhneoir don leor míle míle again, the Irish language in Canada. Hello, I'm Dónall Ó Duḃġaıll, chieftain of the North American Gaeltacht or Irish-speaking community in Tamworth, Ontario, and author of the book Míle Míle again, the Irish language in Canada. Why is the Irish language important to Canadian culture? The Irish language is the foundation stone of all of Irish Gaelic culture. The overwhelming majority of the Irish who came to Canada in the 18th and 19th centuries were Irish speakers on arrival, a large number being monoglot Irish speakers knowing nothing else. The Irish language has been spoken in Canada for almost 500 years. While as the indigenous language of Ireland, its history stretches back to time immemorial. Despite this long history, centuries of colonization, repression, and shame have decimated the language. Languages don't die on their own, but are pushed to extinction by external forces. In the case of Irish, as with many minority languages worldwide, colonialism had a devastating impact on the fortunes of the language. Today, Irish is the native language of only 1% of the Irish population, with around 2,000 speakers in Canada today. The first records of the Irish in Canada date to the early 1500s, just after John Cabot first came to the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. This was the time of the Tudor English conquest of Ireland, and marked the end of native Irish rule, as well as the collapse of Gaelic institutions of education, patronage for the traditional arts. Ireland was converted into England's first overseas colony. Involuntary transportees were sent to toil on the New World plantations, while those who fled to France found themselves amongst the earliest settlers recruited for the St. Lawrence Valley. Even at this early stage, the traditional Gaelic arts were present in Canadian society, such as the poem Untitled Chapter, which was composed around 1700. Yún me fiha milas, nir casogordum Christi, capel bona queira, Atiano in Yilton ver, a quinta druis glantan, is a burhach begaltan. Feed is nagan snorha, a chasfa fea dover. St. John's, Newfoundland, became home to the poet Dónall Ó Duḃġaıll, composing pieces reflecting Gaelic life in the colony. Irish was the common language of Halifax, Nova Scotia, with over 1/3 of the population being Irish by 1837. PEI grew to be over 1/4 Irish, and New Brunswick saw 65,000 Irish arrive in only 8 years, between 1827 and 1835. Many arrivals would have only spoken Irish, with Canadian port authorities in the 1840s frequently commenting on the inability of entire shiploads of immigrants from Ireland to speak English. Ontario saw the greatest growth, with the Irish sent to relief settlements there, to remove them from the enforced endemic poverty of the Gaelic west of Ireland. Charles Lyell, travelling north of Toronto in 1842, gives a good description of rural Canada at this time. At length we reached a log house and thought our troubles at an end. But the inmates, though eager to serve us, could not comprehend a syllable of our language. I tried English, French, and German all in vain. Tired and disappointed, we walked to another log house a mile further on, leading our weary horses, and then to others, but with no better success. We were as among foreigners in a strange land. Some of them could speak Gaelic, others Welsh, and others Irish. The Great Irish Potato Famine was a humanitarian disaster, and saw emigration from Ireland on a scale never before witnessed. A natural potato blight infected European stocks, causing widespread crop failures. In Ireland, this natural disaster collided with the system of British colonial oppression of the native Irish, forcing the Gaelic Irish onto the most marginal of lands and effectively limiting them to a potato-based diet. Only in Ireland did the failure of this potato crop cause mass famine and death. Monolingual Irish speakers were hit worst by the famine, representing the largest numbers of deaths and emigrations. Before its end as one of the longest famines in recorded human history, approximately 1.5 million lives would be lost. Around 2 million would flee to Britain, Canada, America, and other areas, with monolingual Irish speakers making up the majority of refugees. The loss of so many speakers and the ripple effects throughout the population would, as Joseph O'Neill states, nearly erase a language and a culture thousands of years old. The famine brought more Irish speakers to Canada than at any previous time. The Scottish and Irish Gaelic languages, with roughly equal numbers of speakers, and at the time considered dialects of one mother language, were the third most commonly spoken European languages in Canada after French and English, with 1 out of every 10 Canadians speaking either Irish or Scottish Gaelic. Tomás Dónall Ó Duḃġaıll, when travelling in Canada in the late 19th century, wrote, "Is cinnte go bhfuil níos mó daoine ar an mórthírsá thugas Gaeilge ón atá in éireann." A unique Gaelic North America existed, with a language widely used in cities such as New York, Boston, Halifax, and Toronto. With the language came the highest of Gaelic arts. Poetry and songs were composed, stories were told in Irish by Canadian settlers. Most importantly, the language was alive and flourishing, with many documented families passing the language down through numerous generations of speakers here in Canada. By 1871, the Irish made up 1/4 of the Canadian population, numbering more than the English and Scottish. The Irish were the majority population in every large Canadian town and city, except for only Montreal and Quebec City. 2/3 of all the Irish in Canada were found in Ontario. However, the potato famine had accomplished what colonial authorities had tried and failed to do for centuries, to convince the Irish that our ancient culture and language was shameful and inferior. Increasingly tied to poverty and the memory of mass emigrations and death, many survivors abandoned the language in the famine's aftermath. This was little helped by the Canadian government, which stated in 1890 that the best thing for the Gaelic-speaking races now is to learn English as quickly as they can. The British Education Acts of 1870 through 1890 also dealt a heavy blow to the Celtic languages. Part of the global effort to extinguish minority indigenous languages, the Acts instituted compulsory education across the empire for children up to the age of 10 solely through the medium of English. Children were taught to think, speak, and be English, with corporal punishment for any child speaking a different language. These are some of the most damaging pieces of legislation for the Celtic languages. Within 20 years of compulsory English education, severe language recession was seen in all Celtic areas under British control. This system was designed to strip a colonized people of their language and ancient culture through shame and punishment, and instilled in students a whole host of harmful associations to attach to their culture, such as humiliation, backwardness, and wrongdoing. Despite this, there were still enough speakers in 1890 for Parliament to debate whether Irish and Scottish Gaelic together should become Canada's third official language, with 250,000 Scottish Gaels and 250,000 Irish Gaels across the country continuing to use their mother tongue in their families and in conducting their daily business. Despite letters of support from across Canada, it was declared that the Gaelic languages were only good for poetry and superstitions, and the bill was defeated. These numbers show that the loss of Irish in Canada was not a gradual and unnoticed shift. Rather, it was a sharp decline, which would not have gone unnoticed. Following the famine and the failed American Fenian raids on Canada, overwhelming pressure caused many to abandon the Irish language and hide any trace of it from their children, in order to be more accepted in Canadian society and to pass for English. My own grandmother's family, O'Sullivan, from the Gaelic Southwest, changed their name in the 1860s to Selman, Anglo-Saxon for a fortunate man, and buried all evidence of their shameful Gaelic past. As such, the true number of people with Irish ancestry in Canada is likely much larger than assumed. Children were left only hearing their ancestral language as meaningless hushed tones used amongst adults. This would give rise to Canadian words such as streels, from Irish straelia, an unkempt or untidy person, or hang ashore, from einashore, a contemptible or pitiable person, and possibly even so long from the Irish slán, meaning farewell. As Proinsias MacAngasa comments, the total exclusion of the language dimension from folk memory is extraordinary. The wholesale hiding of the language was only helped by Canadian officials taking the 1901 census, with entries noting Irish as a person's mother tongue crossed out and overwritten to say English. As Bradford Gaunt states, there was an independent or collective effort to underplay the use of Celtic languages in 19th century Canada. It was only at the time of the First World War that the final full generation of Irish-speaking Newfoundlanders passed on. Yet as Brian McGinn notes, the impression remains that the importance, indeed the very presence, of the Irish language seems to have been downgraded or effectively written out of Newfoundland's history. By By 1931, Gaelic had mostly died out in mainland Canada, shrinking to the modern image of Celtic Canada, the confines of Cape Breton Island, and solely the Scottish Gaelic variety. Dr. Peter Toner, who grew up surrounded by Irish speakers in New Brunswick, recalls that many seem to have survived into the 1960s, where probably most had nobody to talk to. The loss to Canadian culture was not just that of a language, it was the loss of connections to both the indigenous Celtic culture of Ireland, as well as the unique expressions of that culture in Canada. The ancient stories and worldview, along with the songs and stories created here, have mostly been forgotten in Canada. Despite an estimated 40 million people claiming Irish ancestry in North America, the language has mostly been ignored in the Irish diaspora. At no point in the 500-year history of the Irish in Canada has there been a time when the language was not spoken somewhere in this country. In 2007, after years of hard work by Seamus MacConcheddige and Ralt McGillichenny, a permanent home for the Irish language in North America was formed as Gaeltacht an Uair in Tamworth, Ontario. Here, each summer, speakers at all levels from across North America come together for immersive education in the language and culture. It was also a Canadian, Commander Chris Hadfield of Sarnia, Ontario, who carried our language to the stars, messaging in Irish from the International Space Station in 2013. She buach cultúr na nGael I an Ghaeling. Agus an Ireacht is mó rág ar sin tír doing. Is tead changalte she adring len ar linghain, agus a grinniu hawail, an núl, a sonnes, a mair, a mrón, agus an ram. Marsin, she quid do achnadi, ach quid voon daireacht na Canada. The Irish language is the pinnacle of Irish culture and the greatest gift from our ancestors, providing a direct connection to their worldview, guidance, happiness, joys, sorrows, and humor to us here in the present. As such, Irish is an unrecognized but an enduring part of Canadian heritage. Go to Midimagrief.